hello to everybody. You're all coming in dribs and drabs, and that's absolutely fine, but it's good to see you. I'm Marian Pallister, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this online event under the banner headline, Catholics and COP26. As chair of Pax Christi Scotland, I'm delighted that we've been able to join with Glasgow University's Theology and Religious Studies Department to host this series of events that we intend will raise issues that concern us all about the effects of the climate emergency. I hope that you'll join as many of those events as possible, each one tackling different aspects of the effects of climate change, and each with a distinguished panel of speakers, as you'll have seen on Eventbrite when you booked for today. May I take this opportunity to thank Julie from the department for all her hard work in putting the events together, and Emily, whom you've already met, who created materials for the events and is pulling all of the technical strings this evening. May I also thank our speakers for this evening and all of you who are joining us. Pax, I keep saying evening, it could be anywhere in the day, because for one thing, one of our speakers is from Uruguay, so hello is a better greeting than good evening. I'm sorry about that, it's dark outside here. So Pax Christi Scotland, well, Pax Christi is an international Catholic peace movement, and Pax Christi Scotland is deeply concerned that the climate emergency is generating conflict and violence throughout our common home. In this event, we'll hear three voices that will explore climate injustice, its effects, and how we can respond. I'm sure you'll all have questions to raise with our speakers. And as Emily said, if you could put those questions in the chat box for our Q&A session after we've heard all three speak. And get those questions down while you remember. It's always wise, because these things go out of our heads. And I'm sure that each question will be very important. But first of all, I would like to ask Hugh Foy, Executive Committee member of Pax Christi Scotland, to bring us all together in prayer. Over to you, Hugh.
Hello, everyone, wherever you are. I'm delighted to be joining you this evening. On reflecting on our themes at this time of COP and being close to Glasgow, I'm reminded of what our friends in the Catholic Non-Violence Initiative invite us to consider as new realities. When we think of the casualties of war, we usually think of the loss of human life first, and perhaps the destruction of infrastructure, homes, schools, some cases even entire villages, towns, and even cities later. Rarely do we recollect the loss or the contamination of landscape and air and water and animal life, often which are irreparably ruined by guns, bombs, chemical warfare, and other weapons. World Watch has signposted the real impact of war on the environment. Defoliation from Agent Orange in Vietnam, Kuwait's water supplies polluted by oil spills in the first Gulf War, and also the devastation of local mammals and multiple species that occurred during the Rwandan Civil War. Taking into account this non-human loss of life is yet another reason to redefine church teaching on war, so as to recognise that no war is just against the environment. Increasingly, countries and communities are in conflict as a result of competing for access to natural resources. Historically, the global demand for fossil fuels is an example of how military policies are driven by access for natural resources. We see diminishing access to basic human rights, including clean water, viable food sources, and sustainable living conditions. Environmentally driven conflicts cross borders and boundaries, both ethnic and religious, exacerbating the intensity of violence and war. The Washington Post even highlights how illegal mining funds arm groups in conflict, for example, in the Congo and Afghanistan. And access to water remains an important dimension of tension among Palestine and Israel. In 2015, G7 members noted climate change is a global threat to security in the 21st century. In light of these realities, we must act quickly to limit the future risk to the planet we share and create the peace we seek. Thus we pause as we begin our dialogue in prayer. Almighty God and Creator, we turn to you empowered by the dangerous memory of Jesus crucified and risen. We beseech you to guide all leaders and power holders in the ways of peace, justice, and the integrity of creation. Protect us from the evils of injustice, prejudice, exploitation, and war. Grace us that we put away mistrust, bitterness, and hatred. Sustain us as women and men of peace, respect, and freedom, and unite us in the making and sharing of tools of peace in the struggle against ignorance, poverty, disease, and oppression, as we serve to protect all of your creation. Grant that in all we do, we may grow in harmony, friendship, and solidarity as brothers and sisters created in your image, to your honor and praise. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Hugh, for that really thoughtful preamble and prayer to what we're going to be hearing this evening. Those thoughts that remind us that this is our common home and we're stewards, not in charge of the planet. And with those thoughts in mind, may I introduce Carmen Artigas Moreno from Uruguay, lawyer and human rights activist. It may surprise you that living in Uruguay, Carmen is a member of Pax Christi Scotland, but then Carmen is quite a surprising person who is active in many areas of peace and justice around the world. The internet is a wonderful tool. Carmen is an expert on mission on the United Nations Internal Justice Council, and as a lawyer, she specializes in international law and the right to development. This evening, she will set the scene for us with her presentation, Climate Change, COVID, and Conflict, the 3 C's Challenging Christians. Carmen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to tell you that I have a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation that can be asked either from Marian or from Emily in case you're interested in going further in what I am going to tell you as headlines. Well, thank you very much to Shuli, to Emily, and to the team because of this invitation. Above all, to Marian, my dear friend from Pax Christi Scotland, which is also very generous to invite me to this kind of activities. I try to focus on climate change, on COVID, and on conflict, because I think they are the 3 goons, speaking in terms of Ignatian spirituality, that are really hurting mankind in these days. And also they are social sins interacting among themselves, because we can see that there are impacts of COVID in in conflict, impacts of COVID, and the possibility of gathering data for climate change. And I am going to explain this a little bit. But in order to more or less situate what I want to say, you know that 85% of the population in the world is affected by human-induced climate change, that 4/5 of the land on Earth is affected by climate change, and that the energy crisis has been accelerated because of pandemics, the extreme weather events, and of course, because of political problems. 2 billion people are living under severe water stress, and that is why in these nationally determined contributions that are being managed in the Glasgow table, they are talking about water and food as priorities for these contributions. I would also like to mention that the focus of Glasgow, I mean, besides the specific things, is in mitigation, adaptations, finance, and collaboration. But I think that we have not forget that although mitigation is important, adaptation is fundamental for vulnerable populations and habitats. I mean, we can start reducing emissions, but this is a long-term process. And if we do not support populations to adapt, the crisis will be deepening day after day. And there is also another issue, which is the impact of the pandemics on the land, marine, and air-based observing systems. I mean, many data about climate change have been severely delayed, severely hampered because of the impact of the pandemics that made flights impossible, made the gathering of people, the gathering of scientists impossible. And this is a pandemic's effect on the information on climate change. In connection with COVID, the other C, you know that less than 30% of the population in poor nations is vaccinated, 10%. Meanwhile, 75% of the shots in high and upper middle income countries have been developed without problem. And we are also witnesses a global oxygen crisis, which is severely harming the poorest countries. You know that plastics again is visiting us, and that 3.4 billion face masks are discarded daily. For example, this is a figure between December 2019 to June 2020. So we have the pandemics severely affecting the environment. And also we have to understand that 8 out of 10 people pushed into poverty because of the pandemics are projected to live in the world's poorest country by 2030. We have here another ominous threat, which is the inequality in access to health service. And this is not only, I mean, provoking problems with COVID, but with every possible illness and health problems in the world. So we depart from a very, very unfair situation in connection with health services. We go to conflict. In 2020, we had 34 armed conflicts, which were severely deepened in terms of consequences by COVID, especially in Syria and Yemen, and of course this year in Afghanistan. And 80% of the conflicts are in big biodiversity hotspots. So there are people being killed, but there are also, I mean, exponents of nature being killed. We witness also an increase of military expenditure, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament has clearly shown how the investment in nuclear weapons, but I would say in any kind of weapon, is being divested from strategies against climate change or for the fighting of COVID. I would like to mention very briefly something that has been mentioned before, and it is the case of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a case study for the merging between conflict, COVID, and climate change. I mean, we have in Afghanistan an acute and chronic food insecurity, 90% of the population before the poverty line, 35% of the total population requiring urgent humanitarian assistance. But now we find that because of the war and because of the big countries withdrawing from Afghanistan, irrigation, which is fundamental for the country, seems a dream. And so irrigation has now become a part of humanitarian rather than of development assistance. So this is a country where the drought is, I mean, provoking tremendous problems since long. And now with the conflict, we have a sort of mutual feedback because people try to get water spots, and these provoke further conflicts among communities. And another terrible thing is that, of course, COVID is, I mean, running all over the country with very few vaccinations, and also these black fungus epidemics, which is summing up to the COVID impact. And you know, I do not need to tell you what's happening with the hospitals in Afghanistan. So this is a sort of case study about how these three things merge, and I hope to write something in the future about this. I will go now to the church efforts so as not to take more than my time. You know that the church efforts, I mean, at least from the Catholic Church, and I mean, accompanied by many other churches, is the need for ecumenic and interreligious dialogue to face these threats. In terms of the Catholic Church, well, we have to look into the social doctrine of the church, because these are, I mean, these are problems of nature by affecting human beings, provoked by human beings and affected by human beings. And we need to sort of merge the social doctrine of the church with the Human Rights Charter. Then we have the responses. Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, the work of the Pontifical Academy for Life in connection with the global health inequality issue. We have the COVID-19 Commission, and also the Faith and Science towards COP26, which is this document signed by the Pope and other religious leaders that was put on the table of Glasgow. I have no time to go through all of them. I would just like to, well, to mention again that you have them in my PowerPoint, but for instance, in connection with Laudato Si, we have the Laudato Si platform, a call for action, and there are some very important components which you all know, but I think must be developed further, which is the response to the cry of the earth, the response to the cry of the poor, a new economics based on ecological approaches, the adoption of sustainable lifestyles, the ecological education, the ecological spirituality, and the community engagement and participatory actions. These are part of the responses of the church I wanted to tackle. These are just headlines. You can read more in my PowerPoint and of course in the websites. In order to finish, I would like to mention Fratelli Tutti, because we are facing a problem, climate change, COVID, conflict. People are behind them. The victims are people, but people are provoking them. And Fratelli Tutti speaks about the end of the historical conscience, a general word discard not only of people, but of goods, human rights that are not sufficiently universal, the need to repropose the social function of the property, the need to put limits to liberalism, the injustice of war that has been mentioned already, how to think and build an open world. These are challenges that Pope Francis puts behind us, before us, and we need to look into them if we want to find a response from the church. I am going to finish with something that Pope Francis incorporated to his message from the 54th message of peace, which was called A Culture of Care as a Path to Peace. And he says, a sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be authentic if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. Peace, justice, and care for creation are three inherently connected questions, which cannot be separated lest we fall back into reductionism. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen, for taking us through too quickly, surely, the challenges that we're facing on all fronts. It's been interesting to bring all of those together and to put a new perspective to some of them. So we thank you for that. And that brings us to our next speaker, University of Glasgow academic Anna Blackman. Anna is a lecturer in Catholic religious education at the University of Glasgow, who has taught widely in the areas of Catholic social thought, Christian ethics, Christian apologetics, and political theology. Before she began her time in Glasgow, Anna lectured at the universities of Roehampton, Durham, Newcastle, and Tübingen, as well as working as a research associate in the area of Catholic social thought and practice in the Centre for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. Anna's research focuses primarily on the dialogue between Catholic social thought, political theology, and Christian ethics. She's interested in how the Catholic tradition can learn from other traditions about the best ways to incorporate faith and praxis. In particular, she's concerned with how we can learn from grassroots faith-based movements and organizations. Of specific concern is what such socio-political movements can teach the Church about how best to engage with the poor and marginalized, as well as how more normative theological voices often further isolate these groups. Today, her talk entitled Integral Ecology and Creative Nonviolence will delve into the possibilities of grassroots active creative nonviolence in a world of escalating conflict and militarism. Sounds right up Pax Christi Scotland's street, that's for sure. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you so much for the invite to talk today and to everyone for coming along. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the issues of conflict and environmentalism and pick up on some of the things that both Carmen and Hugh have mentioned. But in the context of Pope Francis' integral ecology and thinking about why we need a non-violent response to this. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis argues that human life is grounded in three closely intertwined relationships with God, our neighbour, and with the earth. For Francis, I think it's become probably quite an often repeated phrase now, this means that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are inherently intertwined. So what harms the earth harms us and vice versa. The view of an integral ecology links the care of the natural world with the pursuit of justice and sets the tone for how Francis believes we should approach an ecological conversion. Amy Willem Echeverria, which I think I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but give it my best go, from the Global Catholic Climate Movement, argues that a commitment to integral ecology necessitates a commitment to what she terms integral peace. And she argues that to work actively for care of creation is to actively work for non-violence. This is grounded in what she says is an ecological spirituality. It's more than just environmentalism. She continues to say, integral ecology is an idea in Laudato Si that invites us to see the interconnectedness of all things. In the same way, an integral peace invites us to an expansive understanding what must be included in building peace within and among communities. If we do not consider just peace and active nonviolence to include all of creation, we will continue to perpetuate lifestyles and systems of violence that wound each other, the environment, and the cosmic Christ. Laudato Si, Francis speaks of this intertwined nature of violence. He talks about how violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. And here he gives an example, if you can read it in Laudato Si, of the story of Cain and Abel, and how this act of violence towards humanity, towards each other, then damages our relationship further with the earth. So this disrupting effect of violence, I think we see very, very clearly when we look at the conjoined nature of damage done through war and preparation for war. Indeed, violence towards the earth, as he was saying, is an inherent part of war, and as well as violence towards each other. And both forms of violence motivate and exacerbate one another. War, military preparations, and the arms trade have a substantial impact on climate change through the use of fossil fuels, plundering of natural resources, and destruction of habitats. We can see the damage of this, for example, in the plundering of natural resources in Chile, Peru, in the Amazon, for use in US-backed military bases in South Korea. There's also other examples of damage to the environment caused by war itself that Hugh mentioned, things like defoliation caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. Global conflict has also caused vast areas to become uninhabitable and infertile through the use of bombs, landmines, pollution, the destruction of forests, other animal habitats. In Afghanistan, I think, as Carmen was saying, a very good example. Over the last 30 years, nearly 1/3 of the country's trees have been cut down through illegal logging by warlords, backed also by the US, or due to harvesting by displaced persons needing shelter and fuel. This has further resulted in drought, the loss of species, desertification. And Afghanistan's also seen its number of migratory birds fall by 85%. And so we also see here how conflicts are driven through access to fossil fuels, as well as reduced access to food and water. And as as Hugh mentioned, things like the Taliban in Afghanistan are a good example of this, illegal mining that takes place there. According to the Ecological Threat Register, the 19 countries with the highest number of ecological threats are also among least peaceful countries in the world. So this is further exacerbating countries' capacities to protect their populations from ecological threats. So these include places like Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, amongst the most problematic. Really, this is a very worrying trend. According to the UN, whilst the number of deaths from war has been declining since the end of the Second World War, violence and conflict are only rising. And again, this is exacerbated by the scarcity of resources due to climate change. In 2016, more countries experienced conflict than at any other point during the last 30 years. And in the past 15 years, more than half of the global population has lived in direct proximity to political violence. And without action, this trend is set to continue. By 2040, a total of 5.4 billion people are expected to live in countries facing extreme water shortages, and the same amount are projected to live in food insecurity by 2050. The consequences of this include mass displacement, competition of resources, increased civil unrest, and political instability. And it's shocking when I was trying to do the research for this. So far in 2021, there are only 23 countries currently not engaged in some form of conflict in the world. Already, international organisations such as the UN are becoming increasingly aware of the links between environmental damage and peace and security. Due to the intertwined nature between environmental degradation and conflict, part of what an ecological conversion must entail then is a conversion to non-violence. The magnitude of the problems of environmental damage demand a non-violent approach, so any solution must be marked by global solidarity and cooperation. We can't restore harmony to the earth without restoring harmony amongst ourselves. And as Pope Francis notes in Laudato Si, that climate change cannot be confronted by individual actions alone. What we need is a new and universal solidarity. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Pope Francis argues that non-violence gives us a style of politics for peace. Here he talks of the devastation of the environment as an act of violence itself, calling us instead to make active non-violence our way of life. What makes this approach so powerful is that it offers us a holistic programme that cuts through all facets of violence, whether these are direct, cultural, structural, economic, or political. Michael Nagler argues that violence is a tendency that pulls us back away from the recognition of unity. Non-violence, on the other hand, pulls us forward towards a recognition of unity. So this therefore can be used to confront anything that disrupts such unity, from excessive economic consumption to the destructive nature of war. Catholic activist John Deere argues that bottom-up grassroots movements are the way to do this. He argues that these have been historically shown to effectively enact real social change. Here he cites things such as the abolitionists, the suffragists, the civil rights movement, women's movement, all of which employed methods of non-violence. As these movements demonstrate, the structural and systematic nature of violence means that it cannot be targeted purely at the individual level, but it necessitates communities of resistance. What is needed, therefore, in response to climate crisis is a global environmental movement. While such a movement's been growing for a number of years, through things, we can see things like the development of renewable energy, ethical consumerism, more direct forms of protest. Where this movement differs to the others is in the issue of time. So this movement is something that people need to commit to now, as activist Bill McKibben notes. An inherent part of this process, therefore, is community building amongst each other, whether this is at the local, the national, or the global levels. So this is an intrinsically participatory process based on people power. However, it's precisely this dimension of nonviolent action that also makes it so successful. According to Maria J. Stefan and Erica Chenoweth's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, they argue that explicitly nonviolent actions are shown to be twice as effective as their violent counterparts, and this is due to the fact that they're much more likely to generate and sustain popular support. They form these communities, they bind people together. The current successes of nonviolent environmental activism should give us some cause for hope here. So we can see this in things such as actions at the Keystone XL pipeline, the victory there, ongoing campaigns against fracking, consumer activism, seen in the rise of the use of solar panels, electric cars. Though McKibben argues that the movement still needs to grow, it can still convince the active oppressors to change their ways. Although he argues that the movement still needs to grow and to convince the active oppressors to change their ways, he argues that it still can nonetheless shift the zeitgeist, so shift the mentality. Importantly, nonviolence is not a passive approach, but rather it's typified by a struggle towards global unity and peace, which is not simply realised through a cessation of violence. As Marie Dennis from Pax Christi International and Ken Boostian from DePaul University explain, nonviolence is not simply a stance or an ideal. It is a relentless process of struggle and transformation that resolutely challenges violence without using violence, transforms and resolves conflict, and seeks justice, peace, and reconciliation for all. This commitment to nonviolence lies at the heart of the Catholic faith. It's the strategy that Jesus offers to us in the Sermon on the Mount and is exemplified in the crucifixion. Here, violence encountered in the world is met with unconditional nonviolent love of God. And this ethic of nonviolence also lies at the heart of creation. As the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative expresses, the nonviolent life to which we are called is rooted in the life of God and God's longing for humanity. This unconditional love grounds, creates, and maintains all life, rooted in the infinite goodness that the three persons of the one God endlessly, inseparably share with one another and with all creation. This eternal communion is the ceaseless mutuality of ontological nonviolence in action, grounded in the foundational relationality of God. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, Francis pledges the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence. However, there's still much work to be done here. Still, many clergy and religious leaders are ill-informed of the gospel teachings of non-violence. And as John Deere notes, even Pope Francis' calls for non-violence have been met with indifference, sometimes even hostility in factions of the church. Bishop Robert McElroy emphasises this as well. He argues how we need to mainstream non-violence in the church. We need to move it from the margins of Catholic thought to the centre. Non-violence is a spirituality, a lifestyle, a programme of societal action, and a universal ethic. Whilst Pope Francis may himself not be attending the COP talks, this doesn't mean that Catholics can be apathetic about its outcome and must work to further this non-violent ethic. Indeed, as numerous movements for justice have shown us, we can't solely rely on our leaders to enact change, and our pre-existing faith communities offer us with a rich resource to move forward. As Catholics, we're called to engage by replicating this non-violent love of God towards each other and towards the earth, calling that we must respond to now, suffer even greater consequences. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., it's non-violence or non-existence. Thank you.
Gosh, much thought, food for thought there, Anna. Thank you so much. That need to mainstream non-violence in the church is a thought for us all, I think. It's something that we try to advocate, but yeah, as you say, there is resistance. So thank you very much for that. And I hope that there are questions going into the chat box for all of our speakers. Please get them there while you remember. I think we're all only too well aware that the blame for climate change can be laid at the door of the global north, the industrialized countries whose polluting emissions have affected the global south in increasing levels over the past century and a half. But with this always in mind, it's timely to introduce our final speaker for today, Dr. Carlos Zepeda. Carlos is Assistant Director of Policy and Practice at the Laudato Si Research Institute at Oxford University. He studied economics and international development in El Salvador, Spain, the Netherlands, and the UK. And inspired by his experience studying and working first with the Jesuits and later as political advocacy campaigner for international development NGOs and civil society organizations in El Salvador and Central America, Carlos explored how power shapes the root cause of social and environmental degradation. He's especially interested in global water and natural resource governance in relation to social justice and the role of indigenous and marginalized communities to effect change, which takes us on from our two previous speakers. Today, he explores the importance of local faith actors in the climate response in a talk entitled Laudato Si, the Ecclesial Networks Alliance, and COP26. Carlos, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Marian, and thank you very much for the really excellent speakers for this opportunity to link the issues of COP26 with something that we hold very dear at the Laudato Si Research Institute, which is the support that we've been giving all the way since our foundation to the Ecclesial Networks Alliance. I have entitled, yes, those keywords, but I will use also the key message of the Ecclesial Networks Alliance that we support as the title of the aim of this talk, which is let us build a planetary community that cares for all life on Earth. That's how the Ecclesial Networks Alliance, which is a territorial expression of ecclesial communities across Latin America, Asia, Africa, North America, and Europe, how they, and Oceania as well, how they see the key issues. So I have started the idea of connecting what's in practice important for the territorial communities, the ecclesial territorial communities with which we've been supporting. And I will use this verb that we've just started using among some of our colleagues in the territory, which is in different languages, it has different verbalizations, but it is Laudato Si Fi, in Spanish, Laudato Si Ficar. And to apply it to the COPs and go beyond. And this is a key thing, because in my presentation, the key ideas are not mine. They are shared all the way by many, many people across the world. And they see, first of all, they see humanity in one planet. They see everything as, and they care about the world, from the poor to the rich. Who is this man? Is Jeff Bezos. He's one of the richest people in the world and founder of Amazon. I'm sure you know this company. And he's pledged 10 billion to the Bezos Air Fund to address climate change, according to an Instagram post recently. And you can see that everyone's engaged with COP26, and you can see images like this visualization of 1 ton of CO2. How does it look like? And it's very striking, because future generations, the children that you see in that picture, both in Glasgow and London and the rest of it, they all are inspired into doing, making a better world. But how do we understand this reality in which there's a certain obvious kindness, and there's messages you can see from the children, you know, there is no planet B, and, you know, everyone is trying to do their bit. At least this is what stems out of the out of this reality, which is that the world is, there's not a doubt, there's not a glimmer of doubt that the world has been getting warmer and the crisis is here with us. So nobody questions that. And the reality is that if we need to change climate policies, we're all in agreement, because if not, with no climate policies, you know where the gigatons of CO2 will lead and what this means for the temperature that we will have, the planetary crisis of exacerbated by climate change in such ways that it will be irreversible. Now, what does it mean to laudatosify the planetary crisis? In practice, for many of the communities we've been working with, is to question, and visualize the connections between the social and the ecological, because it'd be good also to visualize what does it mean to have a socio-ecological injustice in practice. And Pope Francis very helpfully connected in encyclical the social and ecological of the dramas of the planetary crisis, the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor. And he said, listen and respond and tackle these issues simultaneously. Now, if we look closer at the connections, then we start to see that things are not just as they seem. So, for instance, after that tweet or Instagram tweet and things said about Jeff Bezos, someone else said, well, this rich man has set up a venture not and it's called Bezos Fund. So he's, in other words, funding a bank and using it to invest in the green sector, thereby profiting from and influencing how transition happens. So it's not as pristine and well-intentioned as we might think. And many other things, you need to see the connections between social injustice on the ground. Because what so far in the COP26 has been going on, and you see up to 190 policy makers, representatives from up to 190 countries gathering, but seeing all these things as one little head, or big head, so to speak, climate change. But in this disconnection, they do not focus on the issues of social injustice, inequality, how that connects with the economic machinery, how this is connected to the biodiversity extinction, the COVID-19 pandemic, the social injustices. So the creature, you need to dig further, or rather zoom in or zoom out, but see the whole thing in its multidimensional, systemic, social, ecological union. Now, this leads obviously to see things as united as you would see a tree. You see, you need to go to the root causes, the ideologies, the normative frameworks, the power relations. And then as you do so, you can then, you see the interconnectedness, just as the roots of a tree, between the social and the ecological. Then you start seeing better how to process the policies, the actions, the behaviors, so that then you can disseminate those ideas and practices to make a real impact. Now, at the Laudato Si Research Institute, we are based at Campion Hall, and this is very important because we are inspired by Jesuits in Britain, the House of Jesuits in Britain, which is part of the University of Oxford. And there's one thing that after 2 years of the existence of the Laudato Si Research Institute, we began questioning our own self. What would it mean to Laudato Si-fy our research in the light of our support to territorial networks such as the Ecclesial Networks Alliance? What does it mean for us to have a kind of research that actually listens and responds to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor? What should we do? Is it changing our methodologies? Is it focusing on specific topics? What is it that we need to do? Now, Cardinal Czerny, in one of the engagements, a celebration after 2 years, we began our story in 2019, so a very young research institute. And Cardinal Czerny connected online and said a few words about Laudato Si Research Institute, what we should focus. And he'd seen the broad picture and he concentrated on one thing and said, well, you know, I think in terms of action, you ought to look at Berta Cáceres as an inspiration, because it is she was an indigenous environmental activist from Honduras, and she saw how everything was connected in practice. So notice that it was Cardinal Czerny saying, not directly get inspired by Pope Francis, you know, go to the root activist, environmental activist. That's what he said. And I was struck by that, because what this entailed is that we must listen in practice to those communities really and be transformed from their voices into our research, into the way we transform with our research and respond to their needs and to their cries. So I will read directly one of the last fragments of a speech that Berta Cáceres gave when she accepted the Goldman Environmental Prize. And she said, "We must answer their call. Our Mother Earth, militarized, fenced in, poisoned, a place where basic rights are systematically violated, demands that we take action. Let us build societies that are able to coexist in a dignified way, in a way that protects life. Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and of its spirits." Now, for me, this is a powerful message because it is exactly the laudatification of reality. You connect all those things and you see nature and humans, society and humans, as connected to and embedded to nature, and without a flatness of seeing nature as an economic resource, as a natural resource to be dug, extracted and exploited for profit. Now, if we follow that, and we are surely following Laudato Si as a way of transformation, it means that this message of Pope Francis gave, a true ecological approach, always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Surely this will transform our methodologies for an individual, for a researcher, for a practitioner, for an activist, for an artist, someone who is a policymaker. Now, let's question policymakers at COP26 if they are applying these principles. You would surely then see that there's a really, really big elephant in the room that no one's talking about. And this is that we have been doing the same thing for the last 25 COPs. We have been doing the same and using the same old methodologies that use a collective and are based in a collective ignorance of siloed, partial, chunked up knowledge. Notice the homogeneous trend that you have in COP26 at the moment. Notice how it's a very white, it's in skin color, but very white northern accent that has been tweeted all about. But it's not just that, it's the kinds of agendas that are being posted, because there's more presence by those that were able to go physically, and also those that could afford to take all the different communities of knowledge and policymakers to this space. So the voices of the excluded are not present in this dialogue. And so there's a collective blindness and deafness to indigenous and religious perspectives, their wisdom, the ethical values, the conversations on nature-based solutions, and the cries of the poor on the earth. So that is astonishingly clear from a Laudato Si lens. So there's a collective denial of the nature of power, the urgency of the emergency, the shortness of time, because we don't have time. It's just an emergency. So the problem is that systematically we've been failing to meet a single target. If you focus on nature, you see that we have not been able to stop destruction of nature and the world. None of the 28 biodiversity targets that were set on 2010 have been achieved so far. The same can be said with the 25 COPs and counting on climate change. But again, you can also then look into connecting with this poverty and social injustice indicators, the SDGs, inequality indicators, etc. And year after year, we have still not resolved. We have made progress in several aspects of it. But in the same way that you would take a paracetamol for headaches that come because you've got a cancer, you're not tackling the root causes. So how do Ecclesial Networks Alliances, Laudato Si, and user voices in the territories? We're very inspired by the Laudato Si Research Institute by this connection we are gladly supporting to the Ecclesial Networks Alliance. And just to say who they are the Amazon. They're in different places, and they call it biomes, which I'm really inspired by, because they don't see themselves as chunked by countries, but by region, by biomes of where the interconnected ecosystems live. And that's how they see it, not with those chunked up, even geographical chunked, oh, I'm from Honduras and you're from Guatemala, but we're just neighbors. And we're all part of the same land, and we share the same ecosystems, the same rivers. So biomes is a better way of understanding this relationship. And so they're in the Amazon Synod, REPAM, the Pan-Amazon Ecclesial Network. They're in the Congo Basin, REBAC. They're in the Asian Oceania region, RAWEN. They call it River Above the Ocean Ecclesial Network. In Mesoamerica, REMAM. In the Gran Chaco and the Guarani Aquifer territory, in Europe, in North America, Canada and the US. And we're not the only ones supporting them. The Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development has been doing that. There's a link, and I can share this presentation obviously, and there's a link to the Ecclesial Networks Alliance COP26 statement that they've been promoting along these days from last week. But let me just gather three, just to finalize this conversation, gather three as examples of the things that they say from the regions. And one said, one of the testimonies, these are extracts from testimonies, there are videos on this website and recordings and statements with longer length. But one of these extracts, it says, I expect the COP26 summit to carry out structural and constitutional reforms to grant autonomy and self-determination, strengthen dialogue mechanisms so that no governmental or private action is unilateral, but rather with the communities of native peoples, eliminate the extractive economy, open pit mining, unconventional oil exploitation from indigenous territories. This is Álvaro Salgado from Mexico, from the Mesoamerican region, REMAM. Or take this one, there is no planet B, we have no alternative. We have to act now. For me, thinking about a fair and more equitable transition means that all communities, more than anything, the most disadvantaged, have to participate in decision-making, the peasant, women and indigenous peoples, who are the ones who are suffering firsthand the environmental consequences. This is Janina Justet from the province of Entre Rios, Argentina, in the Guarani Aquifer and Gran Chaco. And lastly, to move away from the current exploitative relationship with the earth to a relationship of reconciliation, renewal and regeneration, we expect recognition that indigenous peoples understand the laws of nature, that their worldviews are important for understanding reciprocity with the land, that all things are connected, and that all we do affects us, the next 7 generations. That indigenous peoples be fully consulted about using, protecting, and rejuvenating all lands and waters, and that indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and deep connection to the land be part of the way forward. So we need to transform and see how using Laudato Si as a verb for action means that it needs to transform the way we interpret reality and the way, therefore, the way we act. Because if we change the way we understand reality, this interconnectedness, it has implications in methodologies for research, for instance. It has implications for the way we interact, for influencing key social actors. And so we need to listen and respond to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in ways that Laudato Si-fy everything. So thank you. And yeah, open for questions.
Of course, thank you, Carlos. We have that route map of Laudato Si, but we don't seem to be following it just quite the way that we should do. And it's encouraging to hear the things that you've said about Indigenous people, and perhaps when we get to the questions, we can talk a little bit more about how we can get to hear those voices. But right now, I would like to ask Julie to talk about the Theology and Religious Studies Department's inspiration for this series of events, as is the case for so many of us in this strange time of COVID. Julie and I have not actually met in person, but as this event is witness, today that is no hindrance to collaboration and to action. So I know that Pax Christi Scotland frequently offers up a joint prayer and thanks for Zoom, and other platforms are available. But Julie, can we hear from you for a few minutes, please?
Thank you, Marian. Thank you. How did this come about? It's really thanks to colleagues as a whole within theology and religious studies, especially Professor Heather Walton, who's joining us on this call tonight. And she wanted to ensure that we were responding as a subject area to this obviously exceptionally important question, which has been very much generating energy within the university as a whole, as well, as you can imagine. And very often religion gets left out of the loop. You know, this is seen as a kind of science thing. There should be sciencey stuff going on. Maybe there's arts and humanities doing exceptionally rich things, but maybe not everyone expected religion to have a voice here, perhaps forgetting that 80% and more of the world's population are religious. And most of those religious people are based in the global south, where climate change is hitting people worst of all, and where the most vulnerable populations are, and where the poorest people of the world are, and where the most exploited people in the world are. How could it be that religious groups wouldn't have voices to raise and ideas to share and communities to collaborate on finding solutions to the whole climate crisis and injustice that are the root causes of it? So that's why we were trying to coordinate a set of responses. And I do want to mention the Hope Against Hope vodcasts, the 7 o'clock release every day during COP, lots of exciting religious responses to the climate COP26 summit, but also then our own Catholics and COP26 series as well. Now that just is part of a short answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. That was gives us an advert and an explanation. So like buy one, get one free. So I'd now like to throw the floor open, if we can call a Zoom a floor, and the questions, I hope, will increase in the chat box. We've got, now, Emily, I would like you to help me with this, but could I just kick off with one from Hugh Foy to all of our speakers. He says, in what ways can we build on the critique of Pope Francis to go deeper, expand, and more fully critique from Catholic social teaching the capitalist economic assumptions that empirically can be seen to devastate the planet? Trust Hugh to leave the, do the easy ones first. Anna, is that something that you could tackle?
I can try. So I think probably one of the things. I think this is a really big question, but I think one of the things that is at the heart of capitalism, or maybe neoliberalism, is this idea of individualism, but also competition. So kind of pitting individuals against each other, which I think is kind of inherently violent. So I suppose I would say that there is some a non-violent critique kind of cuts through that. But I think also the other thing that I think is actually quite one of the most radical things that we can do, because I think there's the intellectual critique, but then also maybe the practical critique, is re-engage with ideas of community and build communities, because I think that really cuts against this idea of individualism and people competing with each other, and instead working towards some sort of common goal, and offers a different narrative that I think we can show to work. So I suppose I would say maybe emphasizing the communal aspect of this and showing communities where this works. I think that is quite powerful. I don't know if Carlos wants to expand on this.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree. Anna, and I think one of the key things is that in the using Fratelli Tutti as a background of because you can use encyclicals that have been coming with critiques and also with suggestions as to how to look at the reality. I think they've been very constructive and very operational, I would say, for activists, because you can really, and also for academics, you can really apply them and transform the way you do things and the way you understand things. So in terms of capitalism, for instance, there is something really bizarre in many spheres, which is that they tend to chunk up the different things and never dare to name the systemic name of the beast. You never say capitalism. You won't be hearing that as a theme, running theme in COP26 although it's the dominant system, it's not approached like that. There's always proxies of words. And what I really like about the way that we can, as a Catholic community, we can engage with this is by trying our very best to, as I was saying, Laudato Si Fi, and if you could convert all these ones into verbs as well, Fratelli Tutti I, and you can do these things in practice, transform the way you see reality. So this way, for instance, you need to be systemic. You need to connect the social and the ecological. You can do questions that address that in your research. In the practice, you need to name the beast. You need to say it's capitalism, and it's overwhelming neoliberal. That's the model, and then you can start doing things in practice with that. But always getting climate change into the mix with the poverty, with the indicators of inequality. You just don't talk about climate change and CO2, net zero. Have you seen this? This has been the trend. So it's net zero, but nobody questions how we got there. You know, why are we in this planetary crisis? It's all chunked up. It's net zero, but let's forget about poverty for a moment, because there's nothing to do with it. Wait a minute, actually it does. So yeah, I would verbalize and use this transformation of making into verbs the encyclicals and the ideas of Catholic social teaching for practice.
Carmen, would you like to add anything to what we've heard so far?
In addition to what my previous speakers have said, I think that we Christians are not very much aware of the social teaching of the Church. We tend to forget everything that is in there, as we tend to forget Vatican Council II. We really, for example, have now Fratelli Tutti, Laudato Si, but previously we had Veritas in Caritatis from Benedict, and Veritas in Caritatis is really a guidance for overhauling structures. And in that connection, we need really to study more of our own teachings, but at the same time, take a look into the economics of development, because if we think in terms of solution for the problem, but if we think of distribution of the right to development of human rights, and economics, guided by human rights, like in the Amartya Sen's teachings, and also Joseph Stiglitz. So we have answers from the economic side that match many of the social teaching of the Church. So, but we have to study more. And I confess here, that I do not read a lot of our own social teachings in the Church, and there are many answers for many things. Thank you.
As they say, Catholic social teaching is the best kept secret.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm gonna just nip in here, and then I hope that that Emily will go through the other questions. But Carlos, you spoke about those grassroots voices, and I'm wondering, in fact, to all of you, how we get to hear those grassroots voices, because we hear too many times, we hear the voices from up there, but not the ones that really matter.
Well, thankfully, the Catholic world is immense and enormously diverse and territorially embedded in a huge range of realities. I brought the example of the Ecclesial Networks Alliance, which we've been supporting at the Laudato Si Research Institute, but that's just a fragment. That's just an expansive terrain to explore. Now, what I would say, and I will just put an example, for instance, we've been grappling with this because this is a challenge. How do you bring the voices of the excluded into the mix so that we become amplifiers and we spread the word in a way that does not make them into tokens, because this is really important. So this is not about researchers or policy or practitioners or or community. It's not about having an indigenous person in the chair. They are not. They are equals, so they have equal right to say and design policies for transforming, and their wisdoms are exactly or more valuable than the ones that the policymakers and the COPs and the experts are trying to impose on the rest of the world. They've been living, after all, for millennia in communion with nature. So have their wisdoms, their spirituality, their ways of living. What can we learn from them? Now, online, You can do so from the churches, from the universities, you can now do a lot of things. We've been trying to experiment now with what we call the Listen to Earth roundtables at the Laudato Si Research Institute, which is a process of getting them in a virtual table and literally listen deeply to their voices and put in simultaneous translation. Because, you can see, for instance, that is one of the key things. English is the predominant language. Can we break the barriers, disciplinary barriers, social barriers, ecological barriers, the knowledge barriers, so that they can be inside? Anyway, it's not about me. The challenges are they have the knowledge. And our process is just one experiment, but I would be really keen to, with all this community here, to invite ideas as to how we can do things so that we can invite them into platforms as equals, so that we take on board their wisdom, their ideas, and let them co-design with us initiatives, research, webinars, seminars, events, etc., but not as tokens, not as objects of, typically research is people just go and extract knowledge and then they say goodbye to the indigenous person or goodbye, and then, that's the extractive relationship of knowledge. And that is not the way we should do it, from Catholic social teaching, at least, I think.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We are trying to do our bit with this series of talks next Monday and Friday. Certainly, we have some voices from around the world that we hope will give a little bit of what you're saying there, but we need to go so much further. Emily, could you pick up on some of the questions, please? We've still got time for another couple, I think.
Okay, let's have a look and see what the first one in was from Clive. What role should business play in addressing the climate crisis, given that many of the climate issues stem from the actions of business? And then there is just a follow-on from that saying, following Clive from Edward DQ, can we trust those that have created a broken system to fix it?
This is such a big question, and I think about this a lot, and I think probably I'm going to be honest, my answer is probably quite pessimistic, but I'm going to try and not be too pessimistic. I think probably when it comes to business, part of the issue is how we think about what the purpose of business is, and I think it relates to the question of capitalism as well that we had earlier, that we think business is about. I mean, fundamentally, I think about a lot of it is to do with greed and economic growth. And I think probably there's quite a lot to be gained from looking at CST on dignity of work here and what is business really about. Because I think we're in a system now where in a neoliberal system, the government and business, the market and the state are so closely intertwined that it becomes this very elitist establishment, and I think this is possibly why it is so difficult to tackle, because again, coming back to community, there's been this systematic breakdown of civil society, which really harms how we can hold both of these institutions to account. So I think that as Edward is asking about lobbying politicians and business, does this even work? So I think probably my answer would be that we need to look to civil society and a revival of that if we even want to begin to do this, because especially global business, it is such a big entity that it needs at least a communal dimension to really target it, I think. So that's probably not a very satisfactory response. If anyone wants to get in.
I will build on what you said, Anna, and for instance, if we see a world, and a black and white world, where everything is made for profit, then that world has no hope. There's no way we can transform our world with that kind of foundation. So if that is the way of capitalism, then, and nobody wants to unstick from the value of greed, the value of individualism, the value of putting profit above everything else, then there would be no hope. But thankfully, I can say in practice, because I've been doing exactly that, that beyond the tags of many of those are in the corporate sector, there is individuals, there's human beings. And when we appeal to humanity, there is a connection, and that we can use that for lobbying, for advocacy. Because I've been, for instance, in, speaking of Scotland, there's an eco-village in Findhorn. And just this last month, I had been meeting with people from the corporate sector to talk about COP26. And I was really terrified, because I thought that is precisely the community I am not so sure I would like to be left alone in a room full of them. But the way we connected was by appealing to this idea of humans in a common home. And that's how we started the dialogue. And there were people from Extinction Rebellion as well, and the likes of BP. So you can imagine what kind of mix that could have been. But the people that went out of this dialogue were completely, I would say, transformed, at least in the individual level, with new understandings and new ideas. And I believe ideas can transform actions. So there is hope in that, appealing to the connections in humanity, the way of fraternity, the way of Laudato Si. That is the way, because I could have perfectly said, look, I do not condone any dialogue with those monsters. I could have said that. But actually, that is not the way Pope Francis would have gone through it. It's about building bridges, but being very clear where the goal is hear and respond to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth simultaneously. So you are very clear in the transmission of knowledge and wisdom that you will do to them, but you can connect on a human level.
No, thank you for that, both of you. I think it certainly speaks to me perhaps about some of the writings of Audre Lorde when she talks about, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think it's certainly a lot of food for thought, thinking about the role of economics here. I think that's a lot for everyone to think about afterwards. Now, we have a couple of other questions. I'm afraid we've only got time for one more. Let's see. I'm trying to find where we are. We've had a lot of excellent comments come through quite quickly. Okay. So we have separation of church and state. Do we need separation of market or business and state in the same way? Open to the floor.
This is a very good question. I think I want to say yes and no, depending on which aspects we're talking. I think I can think of pros and cons to both, because I think in some ways think the idea of having a totally free market that's totally unregulated by anything can be very, very, very problematic. But then when the market becomes too tied to the state and starts influencing policy decisions based solely on economics, again, that's very problematic as well. So maybe it's not so much a complete separation as actually reassessing what the roles of both are, and that they need to balance each other out and work together, but not sort of both be infiltrating the other, if that makes sense. Because I think at the moment there is sort of a conglomerate of both, which causes a political, socioeconomic elitism for a particular group of people. When both incur on the roles of the other, I think is what I would want to say. I don't know, Carlos, if you've had time to think about it.
I will go back to the practice, to the policies and practices. So when you have these economic elites embedded in the state, and this is a reality that you find in, well, all across the world, but especially in the most unequal region where I come from, which is Latin America, then you start thinking, well, yes, of course, we want the separation because the business profit-making idea is and the hunger to exploit resources is embedded in every single ministry of this of the environment, and I can give you several examples from across Latin America. I mean, this goes all the way, Carmen. You would probably agree with this. The way corporate sectors start weaving in their interests with politicians and start buying their interests and start transforming the way they frame things is encompassing every single thing that the machinery of the government and the state translates into practice. So for instance, you have the framings of water as not as a human right, but rather as an economic good. Why? Because you have Coca-Cola funding certain politicians with a lobbying power and then translating that into the practice. So in a perfectly just world, you would want a clear separation in this case, because you can see the damaging effects that it's having, the socio-ecological inequalities and injustice that you have on the ground.
Thank you. Carmen, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I think that in connection with business, with the private enterprise, one of the things we should advocate for is that enterprises sign the Global Compact of the UN. I mean, this Global Compact covers many issues: environment, human rights, labor rights. And this is a way of having the enterprises, I mean, adhering to some decency in their work. Another thing is that as we have a generalized fear against, I mean, this social teaching of the church, and I agree with Claire that people tend to say this is politics, but this is the teaching of the church. There is another fear to the word corruption. I remember many years ago, I was a young UN staff, and I wrote a paper and I used the word corruption. And my boss called me and said, "Why are you using the word corruption?" I said, "Well, look, bring me another word for this." And this is it. What Carlos was mentioning, that is corruption. And I was very, I mean, I was laughing because I knew it would happen, that, you know, in the conference, some enterprises, I mean, promised not to invest in fossil fuels outside of their countries, but not inside their countries. So this happens, I think yesterday. They say we are not going to invest in fossil fuels abroad, but they will continue to invest in fossil fuels in their own country. So this is a shock. And I smile at Jeff Bezos financing some projects, but he is, I mean, launching lots of mini satellites to the skies, and he's hampering the right, especially of indigenous populations, to look into the sky, which is also common good and which is also part of creation. And he is not paying any attention to the right to scientific research, to the right of astronomers. So these dual dialogues show me that people is not that good as they say they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you all. We could go on, obviously, for a very long time, but time is against us. We've kind of overrun a little bit, but gosh, I'm glad that we did, because of the answers that we've heard and the conversations that we've engendered there. We've got to bring this to a close, and so I really want to give my heartfelt thanks to Carmen, to Anna, and to Carlos, who've raised so many issues, and to you who are with us this evening, who have responded to what they have raised and given us some more. We would hope that the COP26 negotiators would consider some of the things that we've spoken about this evening, this event, and hopefully that they will really work to save our common home for future generations. I'd like to thank Hugh Foy for his insightful opening prayer, and to Emily for guiding us all through the event. Julie and I thank all of you for joining us, for your insightful questions. We hope to see you at all of the other events in the series. So wherever you are in the world, may you find the courage to speak and act bravely as the stewards of this planet, gifted to us by God, and something that is so precious that we need to work to save it now. Thank you, and goodbye for now.